The signal came at 3:14 in the morning. Arrived quietly, the way dangerous things usually do. It passed through the deep space relay station at the edge of the solar system, moved through layers of automated filters, tripped a low-priority flag, and then sat in a buffer queue for 11 minutes before the night shift operator at Geneva Admiralty Command noticed it. His name was Petty Officer Don Voss, and he was on his fourth cup of coffee when the alert blinked on his screen. He almost ignored it. He was glad later that he did not. The signal was not in any human language. It was not in any language at all at first. It was a pattern, a repeating sequence of prime numbers followed by what looked like corrupted audio and then something that resembled a map. Voss flagged it for the linguistics team, marked it urgent, and sent a copy up the chain. By 4 a.m., the lights were on in 3 different departments across the Geneva complex. By 6 a.m., the Admiralty's senior staff had been woken from their beds. By the time the sun rose over Lake Geneva, everyone who mattered was in the same room, staring at a wall screen, watching the translation teamwork. It took 3 days to crack it fully. When they did, the room went very quiet. The message was from a civilization called the Verath Collective. Humanity had made first contact with the Verath 14 months earlier, a brief, cautious exchange of mathematical signals that had only just moved into the stage of basic language sharing. They were not close allies. They were barely acquaintances, but they were people, and their message was unmistakable once translated. They are coming. We are already dying. Does anyone out there still fight? That was the whole message, looped, repeating, sent out in every direction across space like a dying person screaming into a dark room, hoping someone anyone would hear. Fleet Admiral Mara Osai read the translation twice. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and the kind of face that did not show what it was thinking unless she allowed it to. She was 53 years old. She had commanded warships since she was 29. She had fought in the Outer Belt conflicts, survived the Ganymede blockade, and overseen the construction of 6 of Earth's most powerful vessels. She was not a person who panicked. She was not a person who hesitated. She set down the translated text and asked one question. Who is attacking them? The answer came from the intelligence division. The attackers were called the Keth Dominion. The briefing officer, a young lieutenant named Priya Nair, stood at the front of the room and spoke in a flat, careful voice. The way people speak when the information they are delivering is very bad. The Keth were old. They had been expanding across their region of the galaxy for over 600 years. In that time, they had made contact with 31 other civilizations. Of those 31, 22 had been absorbed into their empire as subject races, stripped of their militaries, taxed heavily, and kept just functional enough to be useful. The remaining 9 had refused to submit. Those 9 no longer existed. The Keth did not negotiate. They arrived, they made a demand, and then they waited. If the answer was yes, they took control. If the answer was no, they burned everything from orbit until there was nothing left to argue with. They had done this so many times that it was no longer even considered cruelty by their own people. It was simply procedure. The Verath had said no. The Keth had given them 72 hours to change their answer before the orbital bombardment would begin. The translation team had spent 3 days decoding the signal. That meant there were approximately 71 hours remaining. The room was silent for a long moment after Lieutenant Nair finished speaking. Several of the senior officers looked at the table. One of them quietly cleared his throat. Another reached for a glass of water. Someone near the back of the room began to speak about the distance involved, 140 light years, and about the political complexity of intervening in a conflict between 2 species that humanity barely knew, and about the risk of provoking a 600-year-old empire that had already destroyed 9 civilizations. All of these were reasonable points. Fleet Admiral Osa let the man finish. She let the silence sit for another moment after he was done. Then she spoke. We have warships for this. She said it the way someone might say that they had an umbrella when it was raining, plainly, without drama, as if the only real question had just been answered and everything else was logistics. And in a way it had been. The room shifted. Not everyone agreed. There were more arguments about mandate, about resources, about the message it would send to the wider galaxy if humanity inserted itself into a conflict it had no treaty obligation to join. Os listened to all of it. She acknowledged each point, and then she began to issue orders because she had already made the decision, and the arguments, while valid, were not going to change it. She did not issue the orders because she was reckless. She issued them because she had read the Keth's file. She had seen the list of civilizations they had destroyed. She had read accounts from the subject races, species who had surrendered and lived, if lived was the right word for what they were doing. She had looked at the Varath's message again, that single desperate question sent across the dark, and she had understood something that the other officers in the room had not yet reached. The Varath had not sent that message expecting rescue. They had sent it because they needed someone, anyone, to know that they had existed, that they had been people, that they had tried. Os intended to give them more than a witness. Across the city, in a quiet apartment near the edge of the diplomatic quarter, a Varath named Celoran was sitting in darkness when his communicator buzzed. He was the only Varath currently on Earth, an ambassador who had arrived 8 months ago as part of the early exchange program, a careful, soft-spoken being with 4 arms and large amber eyes that expressed emotion more clearly than his translated words ever did. He had been awake since the signal was intercepted. He had not eaten. He had barely moved. When the call came through, a staff officer informing him that Fleet Admiral Osai wished to meet with him immediately. Celoran sat very still for a moment. Then he asked, in his careful translated voice, what the Admiral wanted to discuss. The staff officer told him that Earth was mobilizing a battle group, that warships were being readied, that the 7th Expeditionary Fleet was being recalled from patrol and armed for full combat deployment. Celoran did not speak for a long time. When he finally arrived at the Admiralty complex, escorted through corridors that were now bright and loud with the organized chaos of a military preparing for action, he was brought to a small side room where Osai was reviewing deployment manifests. She looked up when he entered. She nodded once, the way she nodded at everyone, without warmth, but without coldness either. Just acknowledgement. Celoran looked at her for a moment. Then he looked out the window at the yard below, where ground crews were already moving between vehicles, where screens showed the live feeds of docking bays being prepped. He looked at all of it with his large amber eyes, and something in his face shifted in a way that had no human name. "I sent that message," he said quietly, "hoping someone would mourn us." Osai looked at him. She waited. "I did not expect," Celoran continued, "someone to come." Osai turned back to her manifests. "We're coming," she said simply. Celoran stood at the window for a long time after that. Beside him, his aide, a young Varath named Korath who had been born on Earth and spoke human languages more naturally than his own, leaned close and said something in their language. A question, probably, asking if this was real. Celoran answered, without looking away from the window. Korath did not translate the words out loud, but later, when asked, he described what the ambassador had said. It was not a statement of gratitude. It was not relief. It was closer to awe and closer still to something like fear, not fear of humanity, but the particular fear of someone who had believed completely in the darkness and had then, unexpectedly, seen a light. What Celoran had said, roughly translated, was this: "I think we have made a very interesting friend, and I think the Keth have made a very terrible mistake." By midday, the mobilization orders had gone out to 6 different bases across the solar system. Ships were being pulled from patrol routes, resupply missions, and training exercises. Crews were being recalled. Ammunition manifests were being reviewed and upgraded. The 7th Expeditionary Battle Group was coming together with the quiet, efficient speed of a military that had been built for exactly this kind of thing, and had never quite had enough opportunity to use it fully. In the operations center, Lieutenant Nair was updating the tactical clock on the main screen. 70 hours remaining. Osai stood in front of it for a moment. Around her, the room moved and hummed and buzzed with purpose. Screens showed ship positions, fuel loads, weapon inventories. Voices spoke in clipped, professional tones. She looked at the clock. Then she looked at the star map beside it, that small yellow marker, 140 light-years away, at the edge of known space, where a people were waiting to find out if the universe had anything left to offer them except an ending. She turned away from the map and walked back to her desk. There was work to do. The 7th Expeditionary Battle Group left the solar system 41 hours after the signal was decoded. 12 ships, that was what humanity sent. 12 ships into the dark toward a war that was not theirs, against an empire that had been eating civilizations for 6 centuries. From the outside, to anyone watching, it might have looked like a gesture, like a symbol, like the kind of thing you do when you want to say you tried. It was not a gesture. The 3 largest ships in the formation were Armageddon-class dreadnoughts. Each one was nearly 2 kilometers long. Each one carried enough firepower to crack open a small moon if the targeting was right. They were called the INS Kurukshetra, the ISS Stalingrad, and the S Cape of Good Hope. They had been named after battles, human battles, old ones, fought on a single small planet in a single solar system, because the people who built them believed that names carried weight. That history traveled. Behind the dreadnoughts came 4 destroyer wings, fast, aggressive ships designed to harass and flank and never stop moving. Then 2 carrier platforms, each holding 80 autonomous combat drones in their bays, drones that could be launched in swarms and directed by the fleet's central tactical intelligence. And finally, at the back of the formation, the ship that the rest of the fleet watched with a mixture of pride and quiet unease. The ESNS Ragnarok. It was not the biggest ship in the group. It was not even the oldest, but it had been designed from the very first blueprint with one purpose in mind, and that purpose was absolute, comprehensive, and total destruction of whatever it was pointed at. Its spine carried a railgun array so large that firing it at full power required cutting power to non-essential systems across the entire ship. Its armor was 3 times thicker than standard. Its reactor ran hot enough that the crew had a saying, "The Ragnarok doesn't have a cooldown cycle, it has a patience cycle." The crew called it the argument ender. They said it the way people say the name of something they are genuinely proud of. Commander Yusuf al-Rashid commanded the Kurukshetra, the lead dreadnought, and therefore the fleet, answering only to Admiral Os, who monitored operations remotely from Geneva. Al-Rashid was a broad-shouldered man from Lagos who had been in the Navy since he was 18 years old. He had deep-set eyes and a habit of speaking very slowly and clearly when things were at their worst, as if the calm in his voice could hold the situation in place. His crew trusted him completely. They had seen what he was like under fire. They knew that he did not shake. He spent the first 12 hours of the transit walking the length of his ship, not inspecting exactly but present, stopping to talk with junior crew members, checking in with the weapons teams, standing for a while in the observation bay where the stars stretched out around them in all directions, brilliant and indifferent. He was not afraid. But he was thinking, the way a good commander always thinks before a fight, not about whether they could win, but about what the winning would cost and whether there was any way to make it cost less. The fleet's tactical intelligence was called Herald. It was not a true artificial intelligence in the way that science fiction had once imagined. It did not have feelings, it did not have ambitions, and it did not have opinions about anything except the most efficient way to neutralize a threat. What it did have was speed. Herald processed information at a rate no human brain could match, running engagement simulations continuously, updating its models every time new sensor data came in. During the transit, Harold ran 40,000 simulations of the coming battle. In 37,000 of them, the human fleet won. In the remaining 3,000, the outcomes varied: heavier losses, longer engagements, scenarios where Keth reinforcements arrived early, or where the human ships encountered weapons or tactics that intelligence hadn't accounted for. Harold flagged these as low probability but non-zero. It prepared contingency responses for each of them. Then it compiled a summary and sent it to Commander Al-Rashid. He read it at his desk with a cup of tea. Then he sent a note back to Harold asking it to specifically model scenarios where the Keth did something surprising. Harold's response was almost immediate. Anomaly factor in current models assumes enemy acts according to established tactical doctrine. Historical review of human engagements suggests that enemies consistently underestimate human adaptability. Adjusting for this, probability of mission success rises to 94.7%. Remaining 5.3% accounts for scenarios where enemy abandons doctrine entirely and behaves irrationally. Al-Rashid read that twice. Then he wrote back, "Model for irrational behavior too." Harold responded, "Already running. Results suggest irrational Keth behavior is more dangerous to the Keth than to us." Al-Rashid smiled at that. He finished his tea and went back to work. 140 light-years away, in the war rooms of the Keth Dominion, a very different kind of meeting was happening. The Keth were not a species that spent much time worrying about enemies. They had not had a genuine military rival in over 200 years. Their ships were large and angular and covered in markings that indicated rank, lineage, and conquest history. Because to the Keth, a warship was not just a weapon. It was a statement. It was a way of saying, "Look at what we have done, and know that we will do it to you as well." Keth Prime Vorakin commanded the fleet above Verath Prime. He was, by Keth standards, a celebrated figure, tall, armored, with the deliberate movements of someone who had never once doubted his own authority. When the intelligence report landed on his command deck informing him that a human fleet of 12 vessels was in transit toward Verath space, he read it once, handed it to his aide, and laughed. 12, he said. They sent 12 ships. His officers laughed with him. The report described the ships in some detail: the dreadnoughts, the destroyer wings, the carriers. The Keth analysts had done their best to estimate firepower and capability based on what was known about human military technology. The numbers were not unimpressive, technically. But 12 ships against 60 was 12 ships against 60, and Vorakin had won battles with worse odds than this. He ordered the report filed and returned his attention to the Verath bombardment schedule. There was one officer who did not laugh. His name was Threx, and he carried the rank of sub-commander, which meant he was senior enough to be in the room but not senior enough for his opinion to carry much weight. He was old, by Keth standards, gray around the edges of his armor, slower in his movements than he used to be. He had spent 40 years studying the militaries of the species the Dominion had conquered or destroyed, cataloging their tactics and their failures. It was considered a fairly unimportant job. The dead, after all, were not going to cause further problems. But Threx had, over 40 years, developed a habit. Whenever a new species made contact with the Keth, which happened rarely, but happened, he pulled their file. He read everything available. He looked not at their technology, which was usually inferior, but at how they fought, how they made decisions, what they were willing to sacrifice. He had pulled the human file when first contact was made 14 months ago. He had been reading it ever since. Now, standing in the war room while Vorakin's laughter faded and the meeting moved on, Threx looked at the intelligence report still displayed on the side screen. He looked at the list of ships. He looked at the names Kurukkshetra, Stalingrad, Cape of Good Hope. He recognized none of them. But he recognized what they were: the names of places where humans had fought and suffered and refused to stop. He raised his hand and requested permission to speak. Vorakin allowed it, in the way powerful people allow things they find amusing. Threk said carefully that he recommended the fleet begin a tactical withdrawal from Varath space before the humans arrived. He said that the report's numbers did not capture what the human fleet actually represented. He said that in his 40 years of study, he had encountered species that were powerful, species that were organized, and species that were stubborn, but that he had never encountered a species that combined all three while also showing a cultural pattern of entering conflicts they had no direct stake in simply because they found the alternative morally unacceptable. He said, "These are not 12 ships sent to make a gesture. These are 12 ships sent to win. And what concerns me, Prime, is not that they might win. It is that those 12 ships are not their best. Those are simply the ones that were available." Vorakin looked at him for a long moment. Then Vorakin smiled and told him to sit down. Threk sat down. He spent the rest of the meeting looking at the star map on the wall, at the small indicator moving slowly but steadily through the dark, getting closer with every hour. He thought about the human files. He thought about a place called Ganymede, where humans had been outnumbered 4-1, and had responded by inventing 3 new tactical formations during the battle itself. He thought about a species that named its most dangerous warship after the end of the world, and then staffed it with volunteers. He thought, "We have made a terrible mistake." He did not say it out loud again, but he thought it, clearly and completely, while the rest of the room talked about victory celebrations. In the fleet, as the stars blurred past and the distance counted down, the crews of 12 ships went about their routines, running drills, maintaining weapon systems, sleeping in shifts, eating in the small mess halls that smelled like recycled air and instant food. They were not afraid, most of them. Some were. That was normal. Fear was not the problem. The problem would only come if the fear made them hesitate, and these were not people who had been trained to hesitate. On the Ragnarok, a young weapons officer named Specialist Amara Diallo sat at her station running charge cycles on the spinal railgun array. She had run the same cycle 4 times already. She ran it a 5th time because she wanted to be sure. Because somewhere ahead of them, a people were under fire, and the only thing standing between them and the end was the accuracy of her targeting and the readiness of her guns. She ran it a 6th time. The ship moved on through the dark, and the clock counted down to contact. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at 600 hours, ship time. One moment there was nothing in Varath space except the Keth fleet and the burning columns of smoke rising from the largest continent of Varath Prime, visible even from orbit, dark and wide and slow like something wounded breathing its last. Then, between 1 second and the next, 12 human ships appeared at the edge of the system's gravity well, arriving in formation, running lights off, weapons already hot. Harold had calculated the exit point carefully, not behind the planet, where the Keth might not see them immediately, not too far out, where the light speed delay would give the enemy time to organize. Exactly here, close enough to see, close enough to hit, close enough that the Keth fleet would have no time to wonder what was happening before they had to decide what to do about it. For approximately 4 seconds, nothing happened. Both fleets simply existed in the same space, sensors reading each other, 60 Keth warships and 12 human ones, the gap between them filled with the quiet disaster of a planet being bombed. Commander Al-Rashid's voice was very calm when he opened the channel. "This is Commander Yusuf Al-Rashid of the Earth Expeditionary Force, aboard the dreadnought Kurukshetra. You are conducting an unprovoked attack on a civilian population. Stand down all weapons and withdraw your fleet from this system. You have 30 seconds. The translation software pushed his words across into Keth language almost instantly. Every ship in the Keth fleet heard it. There was a pause of perhaps 6 seconds. Then the Keth opened fire. Al-Rashid had expected this. Harold had assigned it an 89% probability. The moment the first Keth weapon's discharge registered on sensors, Al-Rashid said one word into the fleet channel. Harold. And Harold took over. This was the part that was difficult to explain to people who had not seen it. Human beings could fight. Human beings could be brave and clever and determined. But 60 ships against 12 was a math problem as much as it was a battle, and math at that scale moved faster than any human commander could track in real time. Harold did not replace the crews. The crews fired the weapons, managed the systems, made the thousand small decisions that kept a ship alive in a fight. But Harold coordinated all 12 ships simultaneously, treating the entire battle group as a single organism with 12 bodies, directing each one to be exactly where it needed to be at exactly the right moment. The Keth fleet was used to fighting in a way that was, essentially, the same way every species they had ever conquered had fought. You formed up. You advanced. Your biggest ships absorbed fire while your smaller ships worked the flanks. The flagship stayed near the center. You won through mass and pressure, the way a wave wins against a sandcastle, not by being clever, but by being too much. The human fleet did not form up. The moment Harold engaged, the 12 ships split in 3 directions. The destroyer wings scattered wide and fast, moving too quickly for the Keth targeting systems to track accurately. The carriers opened their bays and released their drone swarms, 160 autonomous combat drones spreading across the battlefield in patterns that looked like chaos but were not. The 3 dreadnoughts did not advance. They held their positions and let the Keth come to them. And the Ragnarok moved to the side. Not to flee, to angle. Specialist Amara Diallo sat at her station with her hands steady and her eyes on the targeting display. The spinal railgun array required a direct line to its target. It could not fire through the ship's own hull, obviously, and it needed a clean vector. The Ragnarok had been moving since the moment they arrived, slowly repositioning, letting the Keth fleet advance while it stepped to the side like a fighter who doesn't block a punch but moves so it misses. When the angle was right, Diallo fired. The sound inside the ship was enormous even through the insulation, a deep, physical thud that you felt in your chest and your teeth. The power draw was so heavy that the lights dimmed across 3 entire decks for 0.4 seconds. On the external sensors, the rail projectiles were barely visible. They were moving at a fraction of the speed of light, and at that velocity they did not need explosives to be catastrophic. They were simply mass, moving very fast in a straight line. The first shot hit a Keth dreadnought amidships. The second shot, fired 1.2 seconds later, hit the ship directly behind it that had been unlucky enough to be in the same line. Both ships went dark, not slowly, not with fire and drama. They simply stopped being functional in the space of a second, punctured in a way that nothing inside them was going to recover from. The Keth fleet's advance stuttered. At the same time, the drone swarms reached the outer edge of the Keth formation and began doing what they were designed to do. Each drone was about the size of a large vehicle, covered in cutting tools and small-shaped charges. They did not try to destroy ships from the outside. They attached to the hulls like insects and began to cut inward through armor, through conduits, finding the spaces between systems where a small explosion in exactly the right place could cause catastrophic failure throughout the whole structure. 2 more Keth ships failed in the next 4 minutes. Not destroyed, just stopped. Power gone, weapons offline, drifting. The destroyer wings, meanwhile, were doing something that made no tactical sense by Keth doctrine and complete sense by human doctrine. They were not attacking the biggest ships. They were attacking the communication ships, the command relays, the smaller vessels that the Keth fleet used to stay coordinated. One by one, fast and precise, the destroyers were cutting the threads that held 60 ships together into a single fighting force. Vorican on his flagship was shouting. The battle was 9 minutes old. He had lost 7 ships already, and the human fleet had not lost 1. His formation was fracturing because his flanking ships could not get orders fast enough, because the human drones were clinging to his hulls, because every time he tried to concentrate fire on one of the human dreadnoughts it moved, because every time he tried to target the small, fast destroyers they scattered, because the Ragnarok was still out there on his flank firing those terrible straight-line shots that went through ships like a needle through paper. He ordered a fighting retreat. He said it loudly and with authority, the way Keth Prime commanders gave orders, as a statement of absolute will that the universe was expected to obey. The universe on this occasion had other plans, because Harold had already modeled the retreat. The moment the Keth formation began to pull back, the two carrier platforms accelerated to new positions they had been slowly drifting toward since the battle began, unnoticed in all the chaos, moving like pieces on a board while everyone watched the louder pieces. They were now behind the Keth fleet's line of retreat, not blocking it entirely. 12 ships could not physically blockade 60, but positioned exactly where the most damaged, slowest Keth ships would have to pass closest to them. And the Kurukshetra and the Stalingrad moved to follow. Vorakin's retreat became a gauntlet. Ships that had been trying to flee found themselves caught between the dreadnoughts behind them and the carriers ahead. The destroyer wings came back in from the flanks. The drones, still attached to hulls, detonated in coordinated sequences. In the next 11 minutes, 14 more Keth ships were disabled or destroyed. The ones that made it through, the faster, less damaged ships near the front of the formation ran. They went to FTL and they did not come back. The battle lasted 23 minutes from the moment Harold engaged. When it was over, the tactical display showed the human fleet, all 12 ships present. Minor damage on 2 destroyers. One carrier had taken a hit that had taken out a secondary weapons bay but left everything else operational. No casualties beyond minor injuries. The Keth fleet, 4 ships retreating at FTL speed. 56 either destroyed or drifting, dark and silent in the space above a burning planet. Al-Rashid stood at the bridge viewport for a moment, looking at the tactical display. The room around him was quiet, not the quiet of shock, but the particular quiet of people who had worked very hard and were now looking at the result. Someone near the back let out a slow breath. Someone else said something short and low that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. It was hard to tell. Al-Rashid's communicator buzzed. It was a private channel, a Keth frequency, directed at the Kurukshetra specifically. He almost didn't answer it, but something made him reach for the receiver. The voice on the other end was Keth, old, measured, speaking in a way that the translation software rendered as careful and precise. I am Sub-Commander Threx. I am aboard the last Keth vessel that has not yet gone to FTL. I want you to know that I argued against this engagement, that I told them what you would do. Al-Rashid held the communicator for a moment. I know, he said. We read your report. Our intelligence found a copy 3 weeks ago. A pause on the other end. Then you know, Threx said slowly, that I was right. Yes, Al-Rashid said. That's why you're still alive. Your ship is not being targeted. Another long pause. I see, said Threx. Then what happens now? Al-Rashid looked out at the planet below them, still burning in places, still broken but intact, still there. Now, he said, we go help the people you were trying to kill. He closed the channel. On Varath Prime, in shelters deep underground where thousands of Varath had spent the last hours waiting for the end, someone at a monitoring station was watching the orbital sensors. They saw the Keth fleet dissolve. They saw 12 ships holding the space above their world, not attacking, just holding. They saw the communications channels open with Varath Planetary Command, offering medical assistance, offering supplies, offering landing clearance for humanitarian teams. The monitoring officer stared at the screen for a long time. Then she turned to the person beside her and said in her own language something that translated roughly as, "They came. They actually came." In the room, the silence broke. Not into cheering, the damage was too fresh, the dead were too recent, but into something that sounded like people breathing again after holding their breath for a very long time. Above them, The Ragnarok drifted in orbit, its guns cooling slowly in the silence of space, surrounded by the quiet wreckage of the certainty that humanity was not worth worrying about. The battle had lasted 23 minutes. The news traveled much faster than that. The electromagnetic signature of the engagement, the weapon discharges, the FTL arrivals and departures, the radio communications spread outward from Varath space at the speed of light in every direction, a ring of information expanding through the galaxy like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Any species with a receiver pointed in that direction would begin picking it up within hours or days, depending on distance. Within a week, a rough picture of what had happened above Varath Prime would be available to every spacefaring civilization within 100 light-years. Within 2 weeks, it had gone further. The species of this part of the galaxy had a network loose, informal, built more from habit and shared necessity than from any formal agreement. Trading routes carried more than cargo. Ships passing between systems exchanged data packets. A signal from one edge of the network could reach the other edge within a month if enough people passed it along. It was, in a way, the galaxy's version of gossip. Usually the news was trade prices, territorial warnings, weather data from shared star lanes. This time, the news was something else entirely. 60 Keth warships, 12 human ships, 23 minutes, 0 human losses. The number passed from system to system, species to species, growing a little in the telling the way all remarkable things do. Some added details that were not quite accurate. Some stripped details away, leaving only the core of it. But the core was always the same, and the core was the part that mattered. The Keth had come to destroy a world. Someone had answered. The Keth had run. In the grand halls of the Sorathi Merchant Combine, a civilization of careful, patient traders who had been paying Keth tribute for 80 years and had long ago decided that this was simply the way things were, a senior council member received the news at his desk in the middle of an ordinary working day. He read the report 3 times. Then he set it down, stood up, walked to his window, and looked out at his city for a long time without saying anything. When his assistant came to ask if he needed anything, he said no. He was thinking. He was thinking about a question he had not let himself ask in a very long time, because asking it had seemed like hurting himself unnecessarily. The question was, what would happen if someone pushed back? Now he had a partial answer. In the border systems of the Keth Dominion, the edges of the Empire, where the subject races lived under Keth authority and had lived there for generations, the news caused a different kind of reaction. Not joy, not immediately. The people there were too accustomed to disappointment for immediate joy. But there were conversations in those systems that had not happened in decades. Private conversations, held in low voices in rooms with no Keth listening devices. About whether the Keth were as inevitable as they had always seemed. About what it meant that a species with 12 ships had arrived without being asked and had refused to accept the outcome. About whether anyone else might do the same. The Keth themselves knew what had happened before the wider galaxy did. Vorakan's 4 surviving ships had returned to Keth space within hours, and the reports they carried were bad in ways that went beyond the tactical. It was not simply that they had lost a battle, losses happened, even to the Keth, rarely in the deep history of the Empire. It was the nature of the loss, the speed of it. The fact that a fleet 4 times the size of the human force had been dismantled so completely, and so efficiently that only 4 ships had made it out. Keth High Command convened an emergency session the same day the ships returned. The chamber where they met was large and imposing in the way that Keth architecture always was: high ceilings, angular shapes, everything designed to communicate permanence and dominance. The council members were old, most of them. They had spent their lives at the top of an empire that had not faced a real threat in living memory. They wore their ranks and lineage markings with the comfort of people who had never been seriously questioned. They were very uncomfortable now. The session was long and loud and went in circles in the way that emergency sessions often do when the people in the room are frightened but too proud to admit it. There were arguments for immediate military retaliation against Earth, overwhelming force, every available ship, strike before humanity had time to build more. There were arguments for diplomatic contact, for negotiation, for finding out what humanity wanted before assuming the worst. There were arguments for simply doing nothing, for treating the Varath engagement as an isolated incident, an anomaly. In the middle of all of this, someone brought Threx in. He had been stripped of his rank when his ship returned, because losing was not something the Keth officer corps handled gracefully. He had been kept alive because someone in high command had read his old report and quietly decided that a man who had predicted this outcome in detail might be useful. He walked into the chamber without his rank markings, which in Keth culture was a significant humiliation, and he stood before the council with the particular stillness of a person who has already accepted that things are going to be bad and is simply waiting to see how bad. The eldest council member looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Can they be beaten?" Threx thought about the Ragnarok moving through the debris field, unhurried, systematic, moving to the next target with the same calm with which it had moved to the first, as if it had all the time in the world and all the ammunition in the universe. He thought about those 23 minutes and what they had contained. He said, "Not by us, not the way we fight." The room went quiet. Another council member, older than the first, with more conquest markings on his armor than anyone else in the room, leaned forward. His voice was sharp. "They are one species, one planet, 12 ships. We have hundreds of ships. We have dozens of subject worlds. We have 600 years of military history. You are telling me that one species that we had never even heard of 5 years ago is simply unbeatable?" Looked at him carefully. He said, "I am telling you that those 12 ships were not their best. Intelligence confirmed that before we engaged. Those were the ships that were closest, prime. Those were the ones that were available." He paused. "I have been studying human military records for over a year. They have been building warships continuously for more than a century. They have shipyards on multiple bodies in their home system. They have training programs that process thousands of crew members per year. They have been building toward a capacity that they have never quite had the right situation to use fully." Another pause. "We gave them the right situation." The chamber was silent. "Furthermore," Threx continued, his voice still flat and careful, 12 ships arrived because they had 71 hours notice, and that was how many they could prepare in time. I want the council to think very carefully about what number would have arrived if they had had a week, or a month, or if they decide that what happened above Varath Prime is a reason to invest further in their expeditionary capacity." He stopped talking. The eldest council member stared at him for a long time. The silence in the chamber was a different kind of silence than it had been before the Varath engagement. It had a weight to it that it had not had before, the weight of a certainty that had cracked. Back on Varath Prime, Fleet Admiral Osai had landed and was walking through the capital city on the planet's surface. The bombardment had hit 3 districts. 2 were still smoldering in places. Relief teams from the human ships were already on the ground, working alongside Varath emergency services, human medics in the rubble, human engineers helping shore up damaged structures, supply drones from the carriers making runs to distribution points on the surface. Osai walked through it without speaking much. She was accompanied by a small staff and by Varath Elder Selmora, one of the senior government figures who had survived the bombardment in the underground shelters. Selmora was older than Celoran the ambassador, smaller, and moved slowly. She watched Osai with her large amber eyes as they walked. "You did not have to come," Selmora said. Her translated voice was soft. "There was no treaty, no obligation. We had given you nothing." Osai looked at the street ahead of them, at the debris being cleared, at the aid workers moving purposefully through the smoke. "No," she said, "there wasn't." "Then why?" Selmora asked. It was a real question, asked plainly, without accusation or flattery. Just genuine confusion, the confusion of someone trying to understand a logic they had not encountered before. Osai was quiet for a moment. "Because you asked," she said finally, "and we had ships." Selmora looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at the human aid workers in the rubble of her city, and she looked at the sky above, where the shapes of human warships were visible as small bright points of reflected sunlight, sitting in orbit above a world they had no claim on and no reason to protect, except that someone had needed protecting. She said nothing more for the rest of the walk. But that evening, she sat down and began writing the address she would deliver to the Varath Parliament when it reconvened. She wrote it carefully, choosing each word with the weight it deserved. She wrote about what the last 3 days had meant. She wrote about what it felt like to watch certainty collapse and find something unexpected underneath. She wrote about what it felt like to learn that the universe contained, somewhere, a people who came when you called. 6 months passed. The Ragnarok returned to Earth and went into a maintenance cycle. The shipyard crews who worked on it moved through its corridors with the particular quiet respect of people handling something they understood to be significant. They replaced worn components, updated targeting software, addressed the cooling system issue on the railgun array that Specialist Diallo had flagged in her post-engagement report. They did their work carefully and without ceremony because that was how they always worked. And when they were done, the ship was better than it had been before it left. Diallo herself was reassigned to the training division, where she spent 3 months teaching new weapons officers the targeting mathematics she had applied above Varath Prime. She was not a natural teacher. She was patient, but only barely, and she had a tendency to expect students to grasp things faster than they could. But she was thorough. She ran each student through the same simulation 12 times, in different configurations, under different conditions, until they could do it without thinking about the steps. "You don't get time to think in contact," she told them, "the same way every time. By the time you're thinking, the moment is gone. You do it until it's in your hands, not your head." Commander Al-Rashid was promoted to Commodore. The ceremony was brief. He shook the Admiral's hand, accepted the new rank insignia, and spent the rest of the day in meetings reviewing proposals for a new class of destroyer that the naval architects had been developing. He had opinions about the engine placement. The architects had opinions about his opinions. They argued productively for several hours and reached a compromise that neither of them was fully happy with, which suggested to both of them that it was probably the right answer. Admiral Osai filed her after-action report as she always did. It was thorough and precise and devoid of anything that could be described as self-congratulation. She recorded what had happened, what decisions had been made, what the outcomes were, what should be done differently next time. She recommended upgrades to the Ragnarok's cooling systems, which were already being done. She recommended additional Herald processing capacity across the fleet. She recommended increased drone production. She recommended the construction of 4 more Armageddon-class dreadnoughts, citing the increased strategic importance of Earth's expeditionary capability in light of recent events. The Budget Committee read the report. They approved everything. Then she testified before the Admiralty Council, which wanted to discuss what Earth's strategic posture should be going forward. The room was full of senior officers and political advisors and people whose job was to think about the long-term consequences of things. They asked careful questions. They discussed scenarios. They debated the wisdom of having intervened at all, and whether it set a precedent that humanity could not practically maintain. When they finally asked Osai directly what she thought the right approach was, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We didn't go to Varath to start something. We went because a people were dying and we had ships. That is our posture. We have ships. We will always have ships. And when someone calls, we will answer." There was a long pause in the room after she said that. Then the Budget Committee chairman, who had not spoken yet, and who was not a military person at all but a small, precise man who had spent his career managing spreadsheets, said, "How many more ships do we need to make sure we can always answer?" Osai looked at him. She told him a number. He wrote it down without flinching. In the Keth Dominion, things were quieter but more complicated. The High Council had not retaliated against Earth. They had debated it for weeks. They had looked at the numbers, at the shipyard capacity, at the intelligence assessments. They had read Threx's full report, which he had written out in careful detail after his appearance before the Council, because he believed that even a Council too proud to act on good information deserved to have it. The report concluded that an offensive campaign against Earth, in the current state of human military production, was not a tactically sound decision. The Council read it. They did not commission a retaliatory strike. They also did not release it to anyone else because the contents were embarrassing. But they had read it, and the reading had done something to them, had introduced a hesitation that had not been there before. The Dominion was still large. It was still powerful. It still had hundreds of ships, but it had developed, for the first time in its history, an edge of uncertainty. A small, uncomfortable awareness that there was at least one thing out there in the galaxy that it could not simply proceed past. The effects of this uncertainty moved outward slowly. Not quickly. Keth administrative culture did not change quickly, but in the subject worlds at the Empire's edges, the tribute assessors came less frequently. A scheduled military exercise near the border with a subject species was quietly postponed. A request for increased resource extraction from 3 border worlds was approved at a lower rate than requested, and then, quietly, further reduced. None of these things were dramatic. None of them represented a change of policy, but all of them, taken together, added up to something that the subject species noticed, a very slight, very careful loosening, a reduction in pressure, as if a hand that had been gripping had relaxed its fingers just slightly without opening. On the border world of Vethara, a planet of the San people, who had been under Keth authority for 3 generations and who had learned over those 3 generations to be very careful about how they talked and what they said, and who they said it to, a pair of San elders met in a quiet room one evening. They had been doing this for years, these meetings. They were not secret exactly. The Keth knew the elders met and did not much care because what could 2 old people accomplish? But they were private. That evening, one of the elders put a data chip on the table between them. On it was the full account of what had happened above Vareth Prime, not the Keth version, which was vague and minimizing, but the signal data, the engagement records, the translated communications. Someone in the wider galactic network had assembled it and passed it along, and it had traveled from hand to hand until it arrived here. The 2 elders listened to it together. When it was finished, they sat in silence for a while. Then the older of the 2 said, "If humans can be called, then perhaps we should learn how to call them." The other elder did not answer right away. She was thinking about what that would mean, what it would risk, what it would require. She was thinking about 3 generations of careful compliance and what it had bought them, and whether it had bought them enough. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "We should find out if they answer everyone, or just the people they already know." Far away, 140 light-years from Vethara, in a relay station at the edge of Keth-controlled space, a young Keth communications officer was alone on a night shift, monitoring incoming traffic. Her name was Sara. She was 24 years old and she had grown up in a part of the Dominion where conquest history was taught in school as something glorious, something to be proud of. She had believed this without question for most of her life, the way you believe things that are simply always present, always stated as fact, never examined. She had started examining it 6 months ago when the battle records came through her station. She had been on duty when the data arrived, the signal intercepts, the engagement signatures, the open channel communications. She had listened to Al-Rashid's voice saying, "Stand down or be destroyed. You have 30 seconds." And then she had listened to the battle, and she had sat very still for a long time afterward, going over what she had heard. She had been going over it, quietly and privately ever since. Tonight she was monitoring the regular traffic feeds when a new signal came in, not a distress call, not a military communication, just a relay, species to species, passing something along the informal network like a torch passed between runners in the dark. She processed it through translation automatically. She read the message. It was short. It was not addressed to anyone specifically. It was simply being passed along from one receiver to the next, spreading outward in all directions. The message translated read, "Humanity answers." Just that. 2 words in the context that had built up around them over 6 months, a context that everyone in this part of the galaxy now carried, whether they wanted to or not. The context of 23 minutes above a burning world. The context of 12 ships that had not hesitated. The context of an admiral who had said, "We have ships for this," and had meant it simply and completely. Sora stared at the message for a long time. She thought about what she had been taught. She thought about the 31 species. She thought about the 9 who had not submitted. She thought about the shape of the empire she had grown up inside and what it was built on, and whether the building material was as solid as she had always been told. She thought about 2 words. Humanity answers. She looked at her standing orders on the screen beside her, the standard monitoring parameters, the weapons lock protocols, the list of signals she was supposed to intercept and report, and the list she was supposed to flag for erasure. Her orders were clear and had always been clear. She reached over to her console. She deactivated the weapons lock on her station. It was a small action. It changed nothing about anything beyond the reach of her single console. But it was the first deliberate act of her life that ran directly against what she had been told to do, and she felt it in her chest like something opening. Then she opened a new channel unlogged, routed through 3 relay points to obscure the origin, and she began composing a message. Not to Earth. Not yet. She didn't have the right codes, the right frequencies, but she knew someone who might know someone who did. The message she wrote was short. It asked one question. Is it true that you come when called? She sent it before she could stop herself. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling of the relay station for a long moment, listening to the hum of the equipment around her and the silence of space beyond the hull. On Earth, 6 months after the battle and 140 light-years away, Osai was standing in her office in Geneva looking at the latest construction report from the Martian shipyards when her communications officer sent her a flag, a new message, origin obscured, routing unusual, coming in on a frequency that suggested someone was being very careful. She read it. She read it again. Then she sat down at her desk and began drafting a reply. It was, like everything she wrote, short and precise, and without any unnecessary words. It said yes. Outside her window, the evening had come to Geneva. The lights of the city were coming on one by one in the dusk, yellow and warm in the cooling air. Somewhere in the building below her, the night shift was coming on duty. Officers and analysts and operators who would spend the next 8 hours watching the feeds, monitoring the signals, making sure that nothing went unheard in the dark. The shipyards on Mars were building 4 new Armageddon-class dreadnoughts. The Ragnarok was fully repaired and crewed and sitting in dock, ready. Osai looked at the reply she had written. She looked at the city lights below. She looked at the star map on the wall, that broad, mostly dark map of a galaxy that was slowly, quietly beginning to realize that something had changed. She sent the message. Then she turned back to the construction reports, because there was still work to do, and the work was never finished. And somewhere out there in all that dark, there was always going to be someone who needed an answer. They did not come for glory. They did not come for land. They came because we asked, and because somewhere in their strange, violent, beautiful history, they decided that was enough of a reason. Elder Selmora, addressed to the unified Varath Parliament, 2388 AD.